environmental performance is now a leadership test, not just compliance. For a long time, environmental accountability sat comfortably inside specialized departments. Compliance teams managed permits, sustainability teams managed reporting, executives received the summary. That arrangement is under pressure from several directions at once, and the leaders who have not noticed are being noticed by others. Something worth examining sits inside the Conference Board's C-Suite Outlook 2026. Among large U.S. companies, those with annual revenues above $1 billion, 21.3% of CEOs reported that environmental issues are not central to their growth plans. At the same time, the report shows North American leaders diverging sharply from their European counterparts on environmental priorities, with a significant share of North American executives deprioritizing sustainability entirely. Neither finding is surprising on its own. What makes it notable is the context. It describes 1 in 5 large company U.S. chief executives holding an environmental posture that investors, regulators, and major buyers are actively working to close off. The gap between what executives believe their environmental exposure requires and what stakeholders are actually demanding from leadership has been widening for several years. In 2026, it has gotten harder to miss. Harvard Law's Corporate Governance Priorities Report for 2026 documents a record 39 CEO targeting activist campaigns in the first 10 months of 2025 alone, with ESG-related controversies listed alongside strategic missteps and sustained underperformance as the primary triggers. Between 2018 and 2025, roughly 38% of those campaigns resulted in a leadership change. Environmental accountability is now a career variable for chief executives in a way it was not 5 years ago. The expectations have moved. Most internal governance structures have not. The practical problem is organizational. Environmental accountability was built as a compliance function because the demands placed on it were primarily regulatory: permits, reporting deadlines, enforcement thresholds. The governance structures, staffing models, and executive reporting lines designed around that function are not well suited to the current environment, where environmental risk is showing up in earnings forecasts, supply chain continuity, capital access, and strategic positioning. ESG governance remained fragmented across many organizations heading into the second quarter, with reporting gaps that were visible in January still unresolved in March. The expectation from investors, major buyers, and regulators that companies would have clearer, more integrated sustainability reporting in place by mid-2026 had not been matched by the internal readiness required to produce it. That gap matters not as a reporting problem, but as a signal. Organizations whose environmental governance is still structured around periodic compliance outputs are not equipped to respond to the real-time, cross-functional demands that environmental accountability now places on executive teams. Resource, infrastructure, and supply chain risk have made this an operational conversation. Part of what has moved environmental performance into executive territory is that its consequences are no longer confined to regulatory exposure. Water availability is affecting site selection decisions. Grid reliability is influencing capital planning for manufacturers and data center operators. Supply chain environmental accountability is reshaping procurement criteria, contract structures, and Scope 3 reporting obligations in ways that procurement and finance teams cannot manage without executive direction on priorities and resource allocation. Goldman Sachs Global Investment Research found that corporate boards which integrated climate and energy risk into standard capital planning cycles outperformed peers on total shareholder return by a meaningful margin over 3-year periods. The mechanism is straightforward. Earlier identification of risk creates earlier optionality for response. Organizations that surface environmental risk through standard capital planning processes can act on it before it becomes a constraint. Those that surface it through sustainability reporting cycles, which are quarterly or annual, are working with information that is already behind the decision timeline. What leadership accountability for environmental performance actually requires. The Conference Board data also contains something useful for executives trying to understand where their peers are moving. Among large companies globally, The share of CEOs reporting that environmental sustainability is not a priority falls to 20%. The divergence with North American figures reflects regulatory environment and litigation risk as much as genuine strategic disagreement. Many U.S. executives told the conference board that public sustainability commitments carry reputational and litigation risk in the current domestic political environment, particularly where regulatory expectations are less prescriptive than in Europe. That calculation is real, but it does not make environmental exposure go away. It makes it less visible until it surfaces in an earnings call, a capital markets conversation, or an activist campaign. What leadership accountability for environmental performance actually requires is less about public positioning and more about integration. Environmental risk information needs to reach finance teams in time to affect capital planning. Water, energy, and supply chain constraints need to be part of operational continuity conversations, not filed separately in sustainability reports. Supplier environmental performance needs procurement involvement, not just ESG team follow-up. None of that requires a chief executive to take a public stance on climate policy. It requires the internal governance structures to treat environmental exposure as a business variable, not a compliance output. The organizations that have made that shift are not necessarily the ones making the most visible public commitments. They are the ones where environmental information is already in the room when the decisions that matter are being made. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.